Hello, everyone, and welcome. Let's see here. I am having trouble sharing my screen, so I'll just do this verbally. Here, hopefully this will go. Crystal, can you see my screen?
Yes, I can. Yep.
Okay. All right, here we are. Hello, everyone. I am Jennifer Caddick. I'm the Alliance for the Great Lakes Vice President for Communications and Engagement. Welcome to today's webinar, Making the Connection, Environmental Justice from Washington, D.C. to the Great Lakes. Today's conversation is the second in our four-part series, exploring the Alliance's Great Lakes federal policy agenda. In case you missed last week's conversation, we gave an overview of our top 5 priorities for both President Biden and the new Congress. And today we're digging into our #1 priority, which is focused on environmental justice. I'm looking forward to the conversation today, which will be led by my colleague, Crystal Davis, Alliance for the Great Lakes Vice President for Policy and Strategic Engagement. She's joined by 2 fantastic guests, Kerene Tayloe, who leads federal affairs for We Act for Environmental Justice, and Kerene is speaking to us today from Washington, D.C. And Brenda Coley, who is the co-executive director of Milwaukee Water Commons, and Brenda is speaking to us today from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Before we get started, I just have a couple of quick housekeeping items. We're excited to have almost 270 people registered for today's conversation. Because we have such a large group, all lines will be muted for the duration of the webinar. But we're excited to hear your questions, and you can send us a question at any time using the question box like you see on your screen here. And we will leave plenty of time at the end of the conversation to get to your questions. Also, this event is being recorded, and after the webinar, you'll receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording and a list of resources that are mentioned during the conversation. And so for now, I will turn it over to Crystal. Crystal?
Thanks so much, Jen, and thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us for a webinar on our federal priorities with a special emphasis on environmental justice policy actions. And so, as Jen mentioned, the Alliance has developed 5 priority areas for federal policy work. These are generally the same for President Biden and his administration and for Congress. The details are slightly different as each branch of government has different priorities and authority. And so those 5 priorities are 1, prioritize environmental justice, 2, increase drinking water and wastewater infrastructure funding and stop water shutoffs. 3, fund the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative and restore and strengthen clean water protections. 4, fund efforts to stop invasive Asian carp. And 5, address agricultural pollution that drives harmful algal blooms. And so we know that low-income communities and communities of color are disproportionately impacted by pollution. And so environmental justice seeks to address this unfair distribution of pollution and repair the harm that it causes and continues to cause. It requires that fair treatment and meaningful involvement of people of color and low-income communities happens in the development, implementation, and enforcement of the environmental laws and regulations and policies. And so the Great Lakes region has an opportunity to really lead the way in environmental justice right now. There are specific actions that the federal government can take to address environmental justice in the Great Lakes. For example, Congress and the President could update the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative to intentionally provide grant funding to communities of color, indigenous communities and low-income communities, recognizing that the ecosystem, restoration can also revitalize our communities at the same time. And so President Biden should ensure that environmental justice is centered in the work of all federal agencies and administrative decisions that impact the Great Lakes and the communities and residents that are dependent on them for drinking water, jobs, recreation. At the congressional level, we're asking for additional funding for initiatives that just promote environmental justice in a number of different ways. And there's more information on our website. As Jen mentioned, we are super excited to be joined by two of my favorite activists today. Kerene Tayloe, who is the Director of Federal Legislative Affairs with We Act for Environmental Justice. She's a social justice advocate, works tirelessly in environmental justice, civil rights, and voter protection. Before returning to We Act for Environmental Justice, she was Policy Director for Green for All. This is a priority for her. It's her passion. In addition to her environmental work, Kerene has worked in many political arenas as well. And she's also a member of a number of boards and organizations, including the world's largest and most influential sorority founded for Black women, Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. I had to say that part. I had to.
No bias.
No bias. I mean, it was part of her bio. I just read it. And then we are also joined by Brenda Coley, Co-Executive Director of Milwaukee Water Commons. Milwaukee is near and dear to my heart. Over the years, she has served in various positions in the nonprofit and academic sectors and brings a long-standing commitment to social justice and community organizing. She's been a nonprofit director, research coordinator, project manager with expertise in leadership development and organizational capacity building. In addition to all of the things listed on her resume, she is a mentor, friend, leader, activist that so many look up to. She's committed to exploring the influences of one's own culture and understanding in ways in which groups of people are treated in society, and using that knowledge to develop strategies to effectively engage diverse groups of people in important community issues. And so we are super excited to have you both with us today. Thank you again. Can you start by just telling us a little bit about your organizations?
I'll let Brenda go first.
All right. Milwaukee Water Commons is a cross-cultural, cross-neighborhood organization that is really interested in the stewardship of our waters, the commonality of our waters, and really making sure that we have, that all people have access to the benefits of the water. We have created and developed a 6-point water city agenda, which we talk about drinking water, blue-green jobs, culture, education, recreation, water quality, and I think green infrastructure. So we have programs and initiatives under each of those issue areas with 10-year goals as well. So for example, under water quality, we have instituted a community swim sanctioned by the Swimming Association, and we've had over 100 people take part in that swim for the first time in 100 years in Milwaukee River. And but our special emphasis on that is to make sure it's accessible and a diverse swim where everyone feels that they can be there. So we have programming really that addresses those issues in those initiative areas.
Should I go ahead?
Yes, please.
So We Act for Environmental Justice. I'm really proud to work for We Act. It's an environmental justice grassroots organization that was founded 32 years ago in Harlem, New York, for folks who have been to the city. And we call that area Northern Manhattan. So that's essentially right above Central Park, 100th Street and moving up. And it was founded, similar to Brenda's organization, by folks who were in their communities concerns about a number of issues. We had a waste sewage treatment plant that was spewing noxious fumes into the air, and people were impacted by that. We've had transportation issues, and we, galvanize and get our community around those issues. So WEACT's work primarily was focused at the city and state level in New York City and New York State, but as anyone knows, environmental justice issues are national issues, are international issues, and the decisions that happen at the federal level happen and have an impact locally, similar to how you all are making recommendations of what federal priorities you'd want. And so my work is to elevate and to lift up the New York policy, the New York issues at the federal level. And our goal is to make sure that communities of color and low-income communities, because they're not the same, they're, in the EJ, we want to make sure that we acknowledge that Black people, Latino people, Indigenous people, they have a different experience, because race typically is an indicator of a lot of where the most harmful facilities are. And then low-income communities that include white people have very, very similar experiences. So we're always clear that you're not all the same. So that's why we say low-income and people of color separately. And so our goal is to make sure that those environmental justice communities are able to participate meaningfully in the creation of sound environmental health and policies and practices. So we do federal work. There's so many bills and things happening now, and we can talk about that more. But we also convene a coalition of 54 organizations that we call the Environmental Justice Leadership Forum, and we're their eyes and ears in Washington, D.C. about any federal issue, any issue at the EPA level, agencies, et cetera, to make sure that they're engaged as they focus on their local issues. We bring them in when necessary on federal issues too.
Great. Thank you both for the meaningful work that you're doing on behalf of communities across the country. Kerene, you talked about your work on the federal level, your boots on the ground in DC, and so we're watching a lot of this on TV and seeing it. You're seeing it in real time. What do you see as some of the opportunities to advance environmental justice policy on the federal level right now?
I will say I'm watching it on TV too. COVID has really limited our abilities to be on Capitol Hill as much as we'd like. But I will say honestly, like with the administration change has come a dramatic shift in focus on climate, on environment, on environmental justice. And so the demand for our influence and our time and our expertise has shifted. Whereas we were defending a lot of things with the Trump administration, frankly, now we're being welcomed into rooms, into conversations that we weren't having. Like I spent more time, I don't know that I went into the EPA much during the Trump administration. I was outside of the EPA protesting, but now I'm being asked, we frankly played a role in Michael Regan's being his nomination to the EPA administrator role. So I think it's been a complete 180. And so federally, we've seen so much movement already. President Biden on January 27th introduced his executive order to address the climate crisis at home and abroad, taking action at home and abroad. And within that was a lot of very strong language specifically to address environmental justice issues, to address just transition, to address job creation with a lens for equity, et cetera. So that presents a new focus. Executive orders, while not legally binding, they do demonstrate how the federal government will engage, and the directive of the administration in terms of how they'll be moving. And so that presents really important opportunities for us to engage. And frankly, we now have friends within the administration. I'm really proud of a number of important EJ advocates and attorneys. Marianne Engelman-Lato, someone I like to lift up. Cecilia Martinez, who's now at CEQ, is an EJ advocate from the Midwest. She's from Minnesota. So we now have more opportunities to not only be asked to be at the table, but our opinions matter a great deal because the administration has shown a strong commitment to environmental justice.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that. To both of you, we'll start with Brenda. Is there anything that's giving you optimism or hope about the prospect of moving environmental justice policies right now? I know we're in the early stages of a new administration, but is there anything at this point that's giving you a little bit more hope than you've had before?
I think building upon Kerene's comments, I want to say that when we first started sheltering at home and having to stay at home around this pandemic, we saw things moving around, and I sort of called it a moment. I wasn't sure when George Floyd died, was killed, which was the same time that we had that experience in Central Park, and a woman named Amy was targeting that black birder, environmentalist member of the Sierra Club, right, for being where he was supposed to be. These things converged, and I was wondering at that time, was it going to be a movement or was it just a moment? But I think with the fact that we were all at home, it became a movement. And the precursor to that, in my opinion, were the mass marches we had about immigration rights, the Occupy movement, and then the Black Lives Matter. And I think when those all things converged with that horrific killing of George Floyd, all of a sudden, issues around systemic racism, the movement was built. You have people from across the country really talking about these issues. And that's why they're listening to us more intently at the federal and state levels, because of the people's movement that pushed these issues forward. And for our sector, that meant environmental justice. So that's how it feels. There are places, I remember going to a place, and I won't name any names, around a conference that was held around water. And I went to them saying, this is not, diverse enough. We have to get people of color. And they're saying, well, no, we're good. 3 months later, now they're calling me and asking my advice on how to get it done. Because the people's movement, the movement decided, and movement is not necessarily organized with one big leader or something like that, but it was a push by the community that they had the time and the effort to look at this. Now what we have to do, our responsibility is to move this beyond performance and to move it really into systemic change, which is harder, but that's our job to make that happen.
Can I add something to what Brenda said about COVID? Just this morning, there was some data that released that spoke to the reduction of life expectancy of Americans because of the pandemic to now be 1 year. So we've lost a year in terms of our life expectancy. But when we add race to that, in terms of how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted us, Black people have lost 3 years of life expectancy, and Latino, Hispanic people have lost 2 years. So when you think about why that is, it is directly connected to the environmental harms and the legacy pollutions that have existed in our communities. And so the reason why not only are we dying more from COVID and we're being impacted from a health perspective because of the pandemic is because of the fact that race is still the biggest indicator of where the most harmful facilities are going to be. And so again, when we put on that thinking cap of how a government who does want to fast track our response to the pandemic, having to address environmental justice, having to address the way race plays into how people are impacted, whether it's, lack of healthcare opportunities, more polluted air in our communities, and higher rates of asthma and respiratory problems, all of that is then required for a government that is motivated by progressive ideas to incorporate environmental justice into our work. And that's why we're seeing this very strong shift in the Biden administration's attack, not only to address COVID, but the broader climate and environmental crisis, which directly impacts how our lives are how we can, transition away from this pandemic. So I think all of those things are connected, and the moment and the movement that Brenda was speaking to require, I think, this new shift in focus. And the question is, for everyone listening, how do we lift up more community groups like Brenda and the work that she's doing in Milwaukee and other places, and not usurp the importance of local expertise, all in the sake of saying that you now do environmental justice when you weren't doing it about 5 minutes ago?
You know, I will say another thing around this is when I'm looking at trying to go beyond performance, and I'm looking at the environment movement and what they need to do really to incorporate environmental justice as a value. And that's really looking at the intersectionality when we're talking about people of color that Kerene is talking about, how we're affected, you know, disproportionately than white people. We're talking about looking at a lens of environmental justice really through intersectionality. And by that, we mean people and planet, because we find that the systems that oppress the people, those same systems are doing irrevocable harm to the environment and to our planet. So those things are intertwined, interconnected, and that's the way we have to see it. And that's how people of color and indigenous people have seen the environment all along. And that's what we bring to this movement, is that it's not one or the other. It is both and together. And that's how we're going to move federal policy.
Absolutely. So that dispels the myth that there's a disconnection between communities of color and the environment. Like, no, it's actually part of culture. And so I appreciate that. There's also this narrative about the fact that, and it goes along with the conversation that you're having now, that there's the traditional environment and conservation movement that's been happening for years. And then there's this separate environmental justice movement that's kind of happened. And then now that we've had all of these instances happen in the country, and we've been sequestered at home to watch it in real time, it begs the question, can we talk about the value in these two movements working together and doing the coalition building, and what value that working together really brings, especially as it relates to policy?
You know, if you think, I was struck by your question, Crystal, because the way Kerene and I were talking about the issue, it was together. You know, we can't even explain the issue without really seeing the connections between the two movements. And so this is something, like I said before, that we bring to the table, this intersectionality, and it's not sustainable for the environmental movement to work without the lens of environmental justice. It is not sustainable. We are not going to make the gains that we need to make around climate. We're not going to make the gains around water quality. We are not going to make the gains around bringing green infrastructure to repair our waterways and our cities if we don't look at these things together. Because if we don't, then we will continue to harm. And, you know, the thing about the federal government, in my experience, I think that in the past, they listened to environmentalists. They believed them. Whether they listened to them or did what they wanted them to do, they believed what we said, science-based, what we said. But they knew they didn't have to necessarily move on it, because in many ways there was no there. There was no push from the community. You know, there was no movement big enough, diverse enough to really push these matters forward. That's what we have now. That's why we're in the position we are now, to make a difference around the environment and environmental issues. They go together because of this movement. So we have to take advantage of that, and environmental movements have to get on the train that's already left the track.
I'll add to Brenda just some historical context in terms of how traditional greens have operated and how it's been a failure. So in 2009, Waxman and Markey was a really big bill to address the climate crisis. And what happened was the Greens and those senators and congressmen who drafted that bill, they did it in this silo where they were only talking to themselves. And it was a very market-based, you know, carbon trading focused a way to address greenhouse gas emissions. And they wrote it up and they put it in this little package. And then they reached out to environmental justice communities and said, hey, you guys, we really like this bill. You should like it too. And it failed because they did not include communities in the process. And what that speaks to, we use this term quite a bit, meaningful engagement. And it's not asking communities who will be the most impacted by the climate crisis to review your analysis of a bill or to say what they to rubber stamp it. It's saying we want to do something legislatively. We want to create a policy. Who all needs to be at the table at the beginning? And that was the lesson that was learned around Waxman-Markey. And it also spoke to why We Act and a number of EJ groups felt the need to be more involved in federal policy. And so right now, when we think about just how things have happened traditionally, the Trump administration forced groups that necessarily weren't on the same side to be on the same side in the last 4 years, because we were shut out of a lot of conversations around, because there was just straight climate denial. There was a dismissal of science. There was a very about face opposition to anything that wasn't going to allow fossil fuel companies to do whatever the heck they wanted within this administration. If it was appointing Wheeler as EPA administrator or putting people in Interior who had direct ties to fossil fuel and other industries, that was their goal. And so everyone was on the outs, and so everyone had to talk. And through that time, there was what we put together, what was called the Equitable Just National Climate Platform, where a number of EJ groups and a number of traditional Greens came together and had to have very difficult conversations about that history of leaving us out of conversations, had to have very difficult conversations about race and how that played a role in not only how we've dealt with each other, but how people of color working in traditional Greens have been treated. And it's really interesting when people want to tell you and talk about diversity externally in terms of networking, but have a really poor work environment for people of color and women in their companies, right? And so there's been that work and that uncomfortable conversations that have led us today. And so when we look at that historical place, to Brenda's point, it has to work in cohort. We can't just talk about reducing greenhouse gas emissions without talking about the fumes that emit from these polluting facilities or that impact people's water, and the people who live adjacent to those facilities being what? Primarily people of color, being, the workers who themselves, are giving up their bodies and sacrificing every single day, but then are coming home with cancer and a whole host of things because of the type of work that they do. So if we're going to address the climate crisis, we have to make sure that environmental justice is critical to that, because when those storms come, when the extreme heat comes, it's usually people of color, it's usually poor people who are impacted first and worst. So to do it in a way that lifts everyone up, you have to first address environmental justice, and it must be part of the conversation.
I want to put a challenge out to the environmental movement. And I think in order for it to be successful and to do the big things that we have some huge, hairy, big things to do, not only with water, with climate, with flooding, all these things, is that I think we need to really scrap the old environmental movement, the old way that we've been doing things. Take it to the margins, really. And together, we need to build a new environmental movement. And that environmental movement has to be multicultural and multiracial. So it cannot have one group dominate like the environmental movement has had in the past, where one cultural group has dominated. You can't do that. You got to pull that back from the center and really all of us go and build something new on behalf of our planet and our people. That's the challenge that we have to do. And if we do that, environmental justice, in my view, will be integrated. The looking at rural and urban divide will be minimized, and the perspectives will be there. But we have to really, no longer is it appropriate for us to come in and diversify a white organization. That's just not going to work. That's not how we're going to move things. That's not sustainable. We have to build something new. We can't come to the table, as Kerene is saying, and review. That's not our role. That's not going to happen. It's not going to work. And especially with the issues and the problems that we have with our planet.
Now y'all see why we had to have these dynamic speakers on. I didn't even need to say anything. They didn't even need a facilitator. They're not talking about bringing more voices to the table. They're talking about breaking the table and building a new one that is made to fit everybody. And community engagement is from ideation to implementation, per Foreman with Environmental Health Watch in Cleveland. Thank you for this conversation. We're going to open it up for some questions. Jen, do we have any questions from the participants or from the audience?
We do, and just really quickly, I will share my screen again so people can be reminded how to ask a question. You can use the question box that is should be sort of at the right-hand side of your screen. So go ahead and send us some questions, and I see a couple good ones here already. First of all, just one quick note. A couple people are asking how they can get involved or learn more about We Act and Milwaukee Water Commons. And so I'll send out in our follow-up, I'll send out links to both organizations. But I think that raises a broader question here, Kerene and Brenda. How can people get involved in these issues in their community? What steps would you recommend to our audience on how to get started in engaging in these critical issues?
Brenda, go first.
Okay. I would suggest that people really take an inventory of the environmental groups in their area and arena and figure out really what issues that you're most concerned with. Is it clean water? Is it climate? Is it both? And find some organizations in your area that speak to those issues. And I mean, that's a simple Google search, and then bring your skills, bring your skills, and these agencies need them to bear. I can do this, I have experience in this, and that's what one of the ways that I would suggest that you do it. Also, I would suggest, and folks on this call are well versed in what I'm sure are the issues. And find out what the critical issues in your city is. Because the thing about environmental justice is place-based, it's location-based. So depending on your neighborhood that you live in or the city that you live in is dependent on the issues that are most crucial in this arena.
Definitely co-sign what Brenda said. I'd like to lift up some EJ organizations that are based in the Midwest, and I'm from the Midwest. I'm from Evanston, right outside of Chicago, so this feels like home. But Peoples for Community Recovery in Chicago, founded by Hazel Johnson. Many believe credit her as being one of the founders and mothers of the environmental justice movement. They're based in Chicago.
Nice.
Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, based in Chicago as well, both on the South Side. In Detroit, Green Door Initiative, East Michigan Environmental Action Council in Detroit, Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition. They do some really good work in the state. Wisconsin Green Muslims. I know they do some work in Milwaukee as well. Just find an EJ group, and when you come to them, come with a check. A lot of these are very small organizations, mom and pop organizations that need support. Capacity is a really big, there's a clear imbalance in terms of how environmental justice organizations are funded in comparison to traditional Greens. If people were paying attention to the big Amazon, Jeff Bezos grant that came out, EJ groups weren't given direct money. It was like sub-grantees, like allowing groups to benefit from having direct relationships with philanthropy is critical to building, and then allowing us to dictate what we need that money for instead of saying, well, you should do this, but asking groups, how do we build your capacity? I think that's a way to support. So come with a check. If you want to volunteer, play in the back. make sure that those community members are able to be in the front and speak for themselves and support their interests. If you're interested in supporting We Act, we have our own membership meeting every second Saturday of every month. We're doing it via Zoom. We just had one this past Saturday, and we do a number of trainings on environmental justice and health, and helping people learn how to lobby at the city and the state level, and also the work that we do federally, and the EJ forum that we mentioned. But there are tons of EJ groups, like Brenda mentioned, that need capacity support, need whatever time and resources you have. So come with a genuine heart to listen and to support the work that they already know what to do, because these people are they're their own experts. So be genuine and don't usurp their power at all.
I just want to say just one thing behind what Kerene is saying, and especially around that when you said the check. The interesting thing is that you are right. My agency, we're small but mighty, but there's 6 of us, right? And we're doing a lot. But I'll tell you, when we have money that's not directly tied to a grant deliverable, that is where the innovation comes. That's where we are listening to the community and we're able to implement a program or a project that we didn't think of, that didn't fit into a grant construct, and that's where innovation comes. So, for example, for Milwaukee Water Commons, we didn't have a grant to support our Cream City Classic, the open water swim. We did that out of general operating funds. We host about a 35-member EJ Environmental Justice Roundtable in the city of Milwaukee, and it's majority of people of color and indigenous folks with white allies. Right? This is not funded by any grantee. This comes out of our general operating funds, and that's where we can listen and find and then do the work that the community is telling us to do. So that's why those kinds of funds are so important, because that's really where the innovation is.
Thanks. Those are excellent answers. And I'm getting a lot of great questions. So thank you to our audience for submitting questions. I have a few questions in here that I'll kind of try to condense into one about siting facilities. So a couple of people are referencing there's a large issue in Chicago, but this is playing out in communities around the Great Lakes where a traditional sort of polluter facility is being moved from in Chicago, it's on the north side, which is traditionally more white community, wealthier, and being proposed to be moved to the southeast side, which is typically been heavily impacted by other polluters, and it's a community of traditionally Black and brown folks. How do you handle, what are your advice for communities for managing sort of facility siting? Several people in their questions are saying, look, we need power plants, we need these factories and things. I'm curious how, Kerene and Brenda, you would advise the siting of facilities and making sure that it is equitable and not continuing to overburden communities around the Great Lakes. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that question.
I have a few thoughts. I know that we bristle at the thought of regulations. I know that is a thing out there. But how in the heck do you work with corporations without having some kind of regulatory relationship with them? So that's the first thing. The activists in the city, have to really, I think, look at regulations and regulating their behaviors in the way that they're doing it. But you also want to inform the community and engage the community around the issue. And from there, see how we need to make those moves. Because this is traditional systemic racism. I mean, that's what this is. We see it all the time. We see it all the time. This is the way it is. We're seeing it played out in everywhere. So we have to, and it's complicated. It's a complicated ball of wax, because if it wasn't complicated, I think we would have, with the smart minds that we have, resolved it. So we really have to listen to the people, engage the community to see where this is hurting them, first of all, so that we can start building in regulations to atone for that.
Yeah, to add to what Brenda said, for decades, for generations, Black, Brown, Indigenous people, low-income people have been the sacrifice zones for more affluent, frankly, white people. And I guess someone wants to say that that's fair, right? And if it's not that it isn't fair, there's that decision of, well, not in my backyard. And so when you have that NIMBY political power to push back against these options, we need to not only think about how to have equity, but why, with as many technological advances we've had, and we know that fossil fuels, fracked, natural gas, whatever you want to call it, is harmful and it's polluting. Those, how do we get to a place when we realize that everyone's life has the same value, or should have the same value? And how do we make decisions that are for the public good? And how do we input cumulative impacts? And that's an important word. Y'all need to look it up if you don't know it. But cumulative impact requires that in the future permitting and location of any additional site, that there be a cumulative analysis of what already exists in a community. And communities of color are already overburdened. So we don't need another facility in our community. So if that natural gas, if we need power, but maybe it needs to be solar, or maybe it needs to be wind, maybe it needs to, we need to incorporate less harmful options so that we can have the power that we need. And that regulation is critically important. If we want to be honest about what's happening in Texas, it's because Texas has its own grid and avoided regulations back in the 30s with the creation of our national energy grid system. And so they have they have very little zoning laws. They have very little regulation of the fossil fuel industry right now in Texas. And what we're seeing is they chose to be independent and not dependent on the other two grids in our country. And that's what's causing this problem. They want to say it was frozen wind turbines.
Right,
no,
right.
It was their failure to put in regulations and to have all a generation mix of energy options in the state that could help, support when extreme weather conditions happen. So regulation is important. Not only does it protect people, but it allows the industry to be more thoughtful about how it does its business.
Yeah.
But if you only let industries do whatever, more people will die, more people will get sick. And when things like this happen and these extreme conditions happen, it'll be on their lap to lie about it like they're doing in Texas. So that's my thought.
Thanks. That's a really helpful answer. I'm getting a ton of good questions, but I'm going to keep, and I know we're at time, but I have one more that I would like to ask Kerene and Brenda. And I know a number of people are asking, as a side note here, are asking for additional resources, some of the links and groups, Kerene, that you mentioned. So maybe after this, Kerene and Brenda, I can touch base with you and we can think about some of the resources that I can send to our listeners today. I have a couple of questions here, getting at the discussion that was had earlier about sort of restructuring some of the way the environmental movement works, restructuring and rethinking how some of the traditional green groups or green movement is working. And so a question here is, what specific suggestions do you have for how groups could restructure to be more equitable? And Brenda, I know your organization, Milwaukee Water Commons, has been very intentional about your structure. So maybe I could start with you and you could talk a little bit more about how your group is structured. And then Kerene, I'm sure you have other thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, Milwaukee Water Commons I think that this work, many times you have this kind of push coming from the bottom up. You'll have it from coordinators, you'll have it from managers, but you don't have that eye of multiculturalism or equitable work from the top. They oftentimes, what I have often heard, I don't hear it anymore, but it's still back there, is that this is mission drift. We're here to talk about the environment. If we're talking about equity, if we're talking about race, it's mission drift. And I think folks have an understanding of what I feel about that. What we really did on the board of Milwaukee Water Commons, we decided that we were going to, and I'm just going to be frank right here, that we were going to pull whiteness from the center of our board and pull it back to the margins, and then build a multicultural board so that we could lead a multicultural organization and maybe give some example to the region as well. So that means that we have to look at what are the things around, and I'm talking really about white supremacy that holds us back. I mean, we just have to look at these things, frankly, the way that they are, you know, and what are those tenets that we need to get rid of. And so, you know, one of those things that I really react to, you know, a lot is this sense of urgency. You know, everything is urgent. Nothing's a priority because we're in trouble, right? So, and it took years and decades to deal with this. Not that we have that kind of time, but we have to stand back, and because many times that urgency is not on behalf of the community. That urgency is on behalf of some other structure or entity. So we made a concerted effort to look at all of our programming. We took each and every program that we do and applied and looked at a number of questions about how to make this organization a multicultural organization. So we found a continuum, and we evaluate our programs based on that continuum. Are we at a 3? Are we at a 5? Are we at a 6? Or have we arrived? And figured out some steps to take in order to get to the next level of building that kind of organization. And so that means we have to, you know, have some hard discussions and make some hard decisions around that. But the thing that I want to leave people with is that you really have to be intentional about it, and you have some metrics. You know, that this is what we want it to look like, and this is what we had. For example, when we had our confluence meeting, we have a confluence every year, and I looked around the room, and not that I know every Black person in Milwaukee, but you know, there's a network, right? And when we look in the room and we don't know how these people got to our meeting, we know we are pushing out our message. You know, that these aren't, and we're not satisfied with our own status quo. So we continue to push the envelope and move into new neighborhoods, and we don't always do it right, but we do make a try. So when we decided we needed to work in and Milwaukee is super segregated, so you have to go over a bridge in order to get to another community. So we had to go over the bridge and get to the Latino community, and we started doing programming, and we had a water celebration on the water where that community is dominant. And we didn't do it right the first time, but the second time we were better. And so you just have to make the move. Oftentimes, and I'll end here, you know, folks will ask me to make the connection with another group, and I say, well, why don't you just make the connection yourself? That's what we did. Call them.
Yeah, I'll add for folks looking to address internal issues around race and diversity in the movement, avoid the urge to make the Black employee or that Latino employee or that Asian employee like head of your diversity and inclusion program. Avoid the urge to give them another plate of work in addition to their work that they're actually paid and hired to do. If you, for some reason, want to include them, consider compensating them additionally for that, because that is a lot of our experience should not be our burden in the workplace, and wanting us to be on these additional panels to address racial issues in your company or your organization takes a lot of energy. So avoid that, and hire people to do that. And I think that is a really good place to start. And lift up EJ organizations, provide the capacity, stop subgranting people. You know, grants are important, but no one is a sub anything. Lift them up with direct support financially, and let us lead the work that we want to do, because all of the solutions to the problems in our communities, I bet you 5 times out of a million or a million out of 5, whatever, we know the answers. We just lack the capacity to get it done. So be supportive of grassroots groups and stop burdening your people of color employees to fix your problems.
One short thing I'll say is that Milwaukee Rider Commons intentionally goes after these issues. So we have a co-director model where we try to model Black and white leadership. And, you know, I have a saying for people of color and indigenous folks: we didn't break it, so we can't fix it, you know. So therefore, white people have to get the knowledge and the skill to fix this issue. And so we try to model that in Milwaukee Rider Commons. And in many ways, Kirsten Shedd, who is our co-executive director, who is white, takes on these issues as Kerene is talking about. That doesn't mean I don't assist, I don't help, I don't give guidance, I don't advise, but who is really pushing that and moving that environmental justice, say, on the statewide policy level is our co-director. So Black people of color can advise, can assist, can help, but the leadership is not on this anti-racism. It's got to be our white allies. It's just not going to happen any other way. So get skilled. It's not rocket science. It really isn't. It's complicated, but get skilled.
Mm-hmm.
And these are all amazing actions to take beyond the statement. And so we've had lots of conversations throughout the summer and the fall and even this winter about everybody's statements that happened in reaction to so many things that we've experienced as a country. And a lot of organizations are struggling to say, what do we do beyond these statements? And our amazing panel have given you a suite of things to consider beyond statements. And so thank you for that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I know we need to wrap it up. I appreciate Kerene, Brenda, and Crystal sticking on a little bit longer. Kerene, you were right. This was going to last an hour, not just 45 minutes. So now we're trying to be efficient with time, but these are really important conversations. So Crystal, I don't know if you want to say anything in closing before I wrap stuff up. It's okay if not. All right, I just did.
Thank you so much again. I think this is an important topic. You'll see that it was #1 on our list of federal priorities. It is something that is near and dear to the Alliance for the Great Lakes. We have listened to our supporters and to communities across the Great Lakes. And when we listened to community, they talked about water affordability, the disparities that exist in these issues and in their communities. And that's how environmental justice rose to the top of our federal priorities. And so you've heard time and time again, I've talked about our report, step 1, shut up and listen. We listened. And step 2 was that we actually acted on what we listened to. And so that was shown by us incorporating those what we've heard into our priorities. And so we will be on the Hill, at the State House, at city council meetings, advocating for the things that we've talked about here today. And so you can, we'll send out some more information about our partners, and you can find more information on greatlakes.org. But thank you to our amazing panelists, and thank you to everybody who took the time out of your busy schedule to listen in today.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you again, Crystal, Kerene, and Brenda. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Talk to you again soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Y'all have a great day. Stay warm.
Right. Yes.